The
I'll
stage
take care of
driver
you.
threw her luggage into the dirt and drove away without looking back. Margaret Collins stood in the dust and watched the wagon disappear. She did not scream. She did not chase it. She simply picked up both suitcases herself, walked to the side of the road and sat down. Nobody stopped. Nobody asked. The sun went down, and somewhere after midnight, with her cheek resting against worn leather and her fingers still wrapped around her mother's locket, Maggie fell asleep alone, abandoned and invisible to a world that had never bothered to see her. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel, hit the bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, and I promise you, by the time we reach the end, you will never forget her name. The stage driver's name was Carl Briggs, and he had a mean mouth and meaner eyes, and he used both on Maggie Collins before the sun had even reached the middle of the sky. She had paid for her ticket 3 weeks in advance. She had confirmed her passage twice by letter. She had arrived at the departure point in Billings before dawn with 2 leather suitcases packed so carefully that not a single corner was wasted. Her teaching primers stacked flat beneath her winter dress. Her mother's recipe book wrapped in cloth and tucked beside the letters. She could not bring herself to leave behind the small tin of buttons her grandmother had collected her whole life, nested in the corner of the second bag, like something sacred. Maggie had packed those bags the way a woman packs when she knows she is not coming back. Carl Briggs took one look at her standing at the boarding area, and the sneer came to his face so naturally it was clear it lived there permanently. "That your luggage," he said. "It is," Maggie said. "Both pieces are within the allowed weight. I checked. I ain't talking about weight." His eyes moved over her slowly, deliberately, the way a man looks at something he has already decided to dislike. "I'm talking about space." Maggie kept her voice even. She had learned to do that years ago. "I paid for passage to Willow Creek. My bags are regulation size. I have my receipt right here." She reached into her traveling coat and produced the folded paper. Carl did not look at it. "Lady, you and those bags together are going to take up room I don't have. Stage is full." "The stage is not full," said a man standing nearby. He was loading his own trunk into the back rack. "I can see 3 empty seats from here." Carl turned slowly and looked at the man with flat eyes. "You got a problem, friend." The man glanced at Maggie, then looked away and went back to his trunk. Maggie stood very still. She had learned that too. How to stand still while the world rearranged itself around her, and none of the rearranging was in her favor. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "I am expected in Willow Creek. I have accepted a teaching position. Children are depending on my arrival. I am asking you respectfully to honor the ticket I purchased." Carl Briggs leaned against the side of the stage and crossed his arms. "Then I reckon those children are going to be disappointed." He pushed off the side of the wagon and climbed up to the driver's seat. "I'll take your bags as far as the junction. You can ride with a freight wagon from there." "There is no freight wagon scheduled from the junction until Thursday. This is Monday." "Then you'll have a nice little wait." He gathered the reins. "Or you can leave one of them bags behind. Your choice." Maggie looked at her 2 suitcases. She thought about what was inside them. She thought about her mother's handwriting on the pages of that recipe book. She thought about the letters from her friend Clara in Ohio. The last letters Clara ever wrote before she passed, tucked into the lining because Maggie did not trust them loose. She thought about the teaching materials she had spent 4 months assembling every primer and chalk stick and handmade alphabet card because Willow Creek's school had next to nothing, and she knew it. She thought about all of it. Then she picked up both suitcases and said, "I will not leave either of them." Carl Briggs looked down at her from the driver's seat with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite amusement, but lived somewhere between the two. "Suit yourself." He drove away. She stood in the dust and watched the stage go, and she did not cry. She had made a promise to her the morning she left her hometown that she would not cry on this journey over anything that was not worth crying over. And Carl Briggs was not worth it. She picked up her suitcases, one in each hand, and she started walking toward the road that led toward Willow Creek. After about 20 minutes, her arms told her the truth. She could not carry both bags the full distance. She had known this, but she had needed to start moving before she could stand still long enough to think. She set the bags down beside a low wooden post that marked an old wagon junction. She sat on the larger suitcase. She pulled out her small canteen, took one careful sip, and put it back. She looked down the road in both directions. Empty. She looked up at the sky. Still hot, still wide, still completely indifferent to what was happening to Margaret Ann Collins, 30 miles outside Willow Creek, Montana Territory, in the summer of 1878. "All right," she said quietly to nobody. "Think." She was good at thinking. It was perhaps the one thing nobody had ever been able to take from her, not the school board in Ohio that passed her over for a position because they believed a woman of her size would not command the respect of students, not the neighbors who had watched her mother's funeral from a respectful distance and said nothing useful. Not the man she had believed for almost 2 years truly saw her. Right up until the evening. He told her that he cared for her deeply, but that a man in his position needed to consider how his wife would be received. He had used the word received. She had understood exactly what he meant. She had left Ohio 6 weeks after that conversation, and she had not looked back once, not even when the train pulled away from the station, and she could see her aunt standing on the platform with her handkerchief working. She was good at not looking back. What she was less practiced at was sitting on a suitcase at an unmarked junction in the Montana Territory with $12 in her coat pocket and 2 bags she could not physically carry at the same time, and no transportation arriving until Thursday. 2 wagons passed within the first hour. The first did not slow at all. The second slowed just enough for the driver, a farmer with a sunburned neck and 2 boys in the back, to get a good look at her before clicking his horses forward again. She watched them go. She did not wave. She had stopped waving after the first one. A woman on horseback passed, moving fast in the opposite direction, and glanced at Maggie with something close to sympathy, but did not stop, and Maggie understood that too. A woman alone on a frontier road had reasons of her own for not slowing down. The sun moved across the sky in the direction it always moved, without asking anyone's permission. Maggie rearranged the bags so she was sitting more comfortably. She pulled out the recipe book and held it in her lap without opening it. Just the weight of it was something. Just the familiar smell of the old cloth it was wrapped in. Her mother had kept that book at the end of the kitchen shelf spine out like a proper volume. She had added to it her whole life in handwriting that changed as she aged, cramped and careful in her 20s, looser and faster in her 40s, shaky at the end, but still precise, still hers. Every margin had notes. Every recipe had a little history beside it. "Make this when someone needs courage," she had written beside the gingerbread. "Your grandmother made this the day she decided to move west. It helps." Maggie had thought about that note a great deal over the past 6 weeks. She put the book away. Another hour passed. Nobody stopped. She ate the 2 biscuits she had packed in her coat pocket and drank a second careful sip from her canteen. The temperature was dropping faster than she expected. The sky had gone from white to the particular shade of deep blue that comes just before the stars appear, and with the blue came a wind that had real cold in it. Maggie had known the frontier nights were cold. She had read about it. She had packed accordingly. What she had not properly accounted for was what it felt like to be cold and alone and sitting on a leather suitcase at an unmarked junction with no fire and no shelter, and the stars coming out above her one by one like small, indifferent witnesses. She rearranged her coat. She thought about Nathan Reed, though she did not know his name yet. She didn't know she was thinking about him. She was thinking about the teaching position, about the children. She had promised herself she would not disappoint about the letter from the school board chairman, a Mr. Harold Finch, who had written in careful, formal language that Willow Creek School had been without a teacher for going on 14 months, and the children were falling behind, and the town was grateful beyond measure to have secured someone willing to make the journey. She had read that letter so many times she had it memorized. She thought about Harold Finch's formal, careful handwriting and the phrase "grateful beyond measure," and she wondered what he would think when she didn't arrive. She didn't let herself wonder long. She could not control when she arrived. She could only control what she did with the hours between now and then. What she could do, she decided, was stay awake. She managed it for another 2 hours. But the cold had a way of working through a body slowly and methodically, the way water works through a crack in stone, finding every small opening and pressing in, and Maggie's body had been working hard since before dawn, the early rising, the tension at the stage departure, the long walk with the bags, the sustained effort of keeping herself calm and functional through every humiliation of the afternoon, and somewhere past the halfway point of the night, without deciding to, without wanting to, she simply ran out of the thing that was keeping her upright. Her head dropped. Her fingers, still wrapped around the handle of the larger suitcase, relaxed slightly. Her breathing slowed. The woman who had been fighting since before sunrise finally stopped fighting. She slept. She slept through the sound of the wind and the distant cry of something in the hills and the slow creak of the wooden post. Her bags were leaning against, and the first sound of hoofbeats approaching from the north on the old cattle road. Nathan Reed had been checking the western fence line since late afternoon and had stayed out longer than he intended, because two of his horses had gotten into the far pasture through a break in the wire, and it had taken him the better part of 3 hours to find them, and by the time he'd restrung the wire and brought the horses back in and noted the other 2 spots on the fence that were going to need attention. Within the week, the night was well along, and he was tired in the particular way that comes from physical work done in cold air. He knew this road the way a man knows the floorboards of his own house. He had ridden it so many times over the past 11 years that his horse, a dark bay gelding named Pard, knew every turn and took them without being asked. So Nathan was only half attending when Pard slowed unexpectedly at the old junction marker. Nathan looked up. He saw the bags first. 2 leather suitcases sitting in the dirt beside the post, one noticeably larger than the other, arranged with a certain careful precision that suggested whoever had placed them there had been thinking clearly when they did it. Then he saw her. The woman was sitting on the larger bag with her back against the post, and her head dropped forward, and her coat pulled tight around her, with both hands still gripping the lapels even in sleep, and she had somehow managed to tuck her feet up under the hem of her dress in a way that suggested she had been cold and had made whatever adjustments she could to stay warm. Pard stopped completely. Nathan sat for a moment in the quiet. "Ma'am," he said. "Nothing." "Ma'am." Louder. She didn't move. He climbed down from the saddle and walked toward her slowly, the way he walked toward a frightened animal, making enough sound that nothing would be a surprise. When he was close enough to see her face clearly, he stopped. She was not elderly. She was not ill as far as he could tell. She was sleeping the sleep of someone who has fought everything available to fight and has nothing left. He had seen that kind of sleep before. He had slept that sleep himself years ago. He looked at the suitcases, then at the road, then at the junction marker. He understood what had happened with enough clarity that it made something quiet and cold move through him. Someone had left her here. This was not a woman who had chosen to camp at a road junction. This was a woman who had been put off a stage or a wagon or some form of transportation and had ended up here with her bags and no way forward, and had waited as long as her body would allow before sleep took over. Someone had looked at this woman and decided she wasn't worth stopping for. Nathan Reed did not consider himself a man of strong feelings. He had worked very hard for a very long time to make that true. But there was something about the particular sight in front of him. The careful way the bags were placed, the coat gripped even in sleep, the feet tucked up like a child trying to stay warm, that moved through his careful construction and landed somewhere he didn't have armor for. He looked at his wagon, the one he'd brought out for hauling fence supplies. He made a decision. He lifted the larger suitcase first, carried it to the wagon, set it down carefully in the bed. He went back for the second one. Lighter, but packed tight. He set it beside the first. Then he went back to where she was sleeping. He had not done this before. He was not a man who touched strangers. He was not a man who inserted himself into situations that were not his to insert himself into. He had built his life very deliberately around a certain kind of solitude, and he had good reasons, and he had kept to them faithfully. But it was cold, and the woman was alone, and he was the only person on this road. He leaned down and said close enough that she would hear it even through sleep. "Ma'am, I'm going to help you into the wagon. You're safe. My name is Nathan Reed, and I'm taking you somewhere warm. You're safe." He said it twice because he believed that what a person heard in the moments between sleep and waking sometimes went deeper than words heard in full consciousness. Then he lifted her. She was not light. She was a solid, real woman, with weight and substance, and the slight, dead heaviness of deep sleep. And he adjusted his hold to be sure of his footing, before he walked the few steps to the wagon, and settled her as carefully as he could against the side of the wagon bed with her back supported, and pulled the blanket he kept for cattle emergencies from under the seat, and tucked it around her. She stirred once, made a small sound, didn't wake. Nathan stood beside the wagon for a moment. He looked down at her face in the dark. He didn't know a single thing about her, not her name, not where she was going, not how she had ended up here, or why she had been left. He didn't know if she had family somewhere waiting for her, or if she was entirely alone in the way that some people are entirely alone, the kind that has nothing to do with geography. What he knew was what he could see. A woman who had gone to sleep holding her own coat closed because there was nobody else to keep the cold out. He climbed up to the driver's seat. Pard turned his head and regarded him with the particular expression that Horse had been giving Nathan for 9 years, which was the expression of an animal that understood human beings better than they understood themselves, and had reached a complicated peace with that fact. "I know," Nathan said to the horse. He picked up the reins. He headed toward town. He did not know as the wagon moved through the cold Montana night with the woman sleeping in the back and the stars indifferent above and the road ahead, empty as far as he could see, that the woman in the back of his wagon was going to change something fundamental about the life he had spent 11 years building to keep himself from being changed. He did not know that. He was simply a man driving home through the cold with someone who needed warmth. But Pard seemed to know. The horse moved with unusual steadiness, as if carrying something that required care. Maybe he was. When the wagon finally reached the edge of Willow Creek and the first lamp-lit windows appeared in the dark, Maggie Collins shifted in her sleep, turned her face slightly toward the faint warmth that was beginning to come off the town, and in the language that sleeping people use when something registers somewhere below waking, she sighed. Just once. Like something inside her had recognized without knowing why that the long cold wait was over. Nathan heard it. He didn't look back, but his hands on the reins, just for a moment, held a little less tight. Part 2. The Cowboy Who Saw Beyond Appearance. Maggie woke up swinging. Her arm came up fast, and her elbow caught the side of something wooden and solid, and the pain shot all the way to her shoulder, and she grabbed the edge of the wagon with both hands and twisted around trying to understand where in God's name she was and how she had gotten there. The wagon was moving. She was in the back of a moving wagon. The night was still around her, cold and very dark, and there was a blanket across her lap that she did not recognize, and her 2 suitcases were beside her, arranged carefully, and there was a man on the driver's seat in front of her broad-shouldered dark coat hat, pulled against the wind, holding the reins of a dark horse she had never seen in her life. "Stop this wagon," Maggie said. Her voice came out louder than she intended. The man pulled the reins immediately. The horse slowed and stopped with a patience that suggested it was accustomed to unexpected requests. The man on the driver's seat turned around slowly, the way a person turns when they want to be very clear that they are not threatening. He was older than she expected. Somewhere past 30. A face that had spent considerable time in weather, not ruined by it, but shaped by it, the way wood gets shaped by years of honest use. He had dark eyes that were looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. It was not the expression of a man caught doing something wrong. It was the expression of a man who had expected exactly this reaction and had prepared for it. "My name is Nathan Reed," he said. "I own the Reed Ranch outside Willow Creek. You were sleeping at the old junction marker alone with no fire and the temperature dropping. I put your bags in the wagon and I was taking you to town." Maggie did not move. She looked at him. She looked at the bags. She looked at the blanket across her lap. "You lifted me into this wagon without waking me up," she said. "I tried to wake you. You were past waking." "You had no right to put your hands on me." "No," Nathan said. "I didn't. I know that. But you were alone on a frontier road in the middle of the night, and the temperature was going to keep dropping, and I made a call. You can be angry at me for it. That's fair. But I need you to understand that I did not intend you any harm. Maggie studied him. She had spent a long time learning to read the difference between a man who said he meant no harm because it was true, and a man who said it because it was useful. Nathan Reed sat very still on the driver's seat and looked at her directly and did not try to fill the silence she was using to think. That was a point in his favor. She pulled the blanket off her lap and held it out to him. "I didn't ask for this." He took it without comment. "And I didn't ask to be put in your wagon." "No," he said, "you didn't." "But you did it anyway." "I did." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, "How far are we from Willow Creek?" "About 1.5 miles." "Could I have made it on foot?" "With 2 bags in this cold, maybe, maybe not." He paused. "I didn't want to find out." Maggie sat with that. She hated that it was a reasonable answer. She wanted it to be less reasonable because it would have been easier to stay angry at something unreasonable. But Nathan Reed was sitting there on his driver's seat being perfectly calm and perfectly honest and giving her nothing to push against except the fact that he had made a decision without her permission. And while that was real and worth being angry about, she was also cold and tired, and 1.5 miles from the place she had been trying to reach since before dawn. "Drive," she said. He turned back around and picked up the reins without another word. They rode the rest of the way in silence. Maggie sat in the back of the wagon with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the road behind them, watching Willow Creek get farther behind her, until suddenly it wasn't until the wagon turned and the road changed and there were lamp-lit windows on both sides and the sound of the horses' hooves changed on packed earth. Nathan stopped the wagon in front of a building with a sign she could just make out in the dark. Boarding house. He climbed down and came around to the back without touching her or offering a hand she hadn't asked for. "Mrs. Aldridge runs this place," he said. "She's decent. She'll have a room." Maggie looked at the building. "It's past midnight," she said. "She won't mind. Tell her I sent you." Maggie climbed out of the wagon, herself, took the larger suitcase herself, then reached for the second. Nathan was already holding it. She looked at him. "I'll carry it to the door," he said simply. She let him. At the door, she took the bag from him and set it beside the first. Then she straightened up and looked at him in the lamplight from the nearest window. "I don't know if what you did tonight was kindness or presumption," she said. "Might be both," Nathan said. She almost said something to that. Instead, she said, "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Reed." She knocked on the boarding house door. She did not look back when she heard the wagon move away. But she heard it. And something about the sound of it, the quiet, unhurried departure of a man who had helped her and then left without waiting to be thanked properly, stayed with her longer than she expected anything about that night to stay. She was still thinking about it when Mrs. Aldridge opened the door, took one look at Maggie's face, said, "Land sakes, come in, and pulled her into the warmth like a woman who had been pulling strays in from the cold her entire life and had never once considered stopping. The next morning came fast and bright, the way Montana mornings arrived in summer, without apology, without transition. The sun simply deciding the dark was finished and acting on that decision with considerable enthusiasm. Maggie was awake before it. She had slept 3 hours deeply and without dreaming, and woken with the particular clarity that sometimes comes after a body has been pushed to its limit and then finally allowed to rest. She dressed carefully. She repinned her hair. She checked her appearance in the small mirror above the washstand and said quietly to the woman looking back at her, "You are here. That is what matters." Then she went downstairs to find Harold Finch. Mrs. Aldridge directed her to the general store, where Finch apparently conducted most of his business before the official town hall opened. Maggie found him there exactly as described, a small, neat man with spectacles and a large mustache who was going over a ledger with the focused expression of someone trying to make numbers behave. "Mr. Finch," Maggie said from the doorway. He looked up. His eyes did what eyes always did when they encountered Margaret Collins for the first time. They took stock. They calculated. They arrived at a conclusion before she had spoken more than her name. Maggie was used to watching that calculation happen. She waited for it to finish before she continued. "I am Margaret Collins. I apologize for not arriving yesterday as arranged. I encountered some difficulty with the stage." Finch stood up from his stool so fast he nearly knocked it over. Miss Collins. Good heavens. We had wondered. That is when you hadn't arrived by evening. I confess we were concerned. He came around the counter with his hand extended. I'm very glad you're here. Please sit down. There was only one chair, and he was offering it to her. Maggie sat. What happened? Finch asked. Was there an accident? You're all right. I'm entirely all right, she said. The stage driver chose not to honor my ticket. He left me at the junction outside town. I spent the night there and made my way in after midnight. She said it flatly without drama, because the facts were dramatic enough, and she did not want his pity. I would like to discuss the school. Finch stared at her. He left you, at the junction? Yes. Alone. With my luggage, Maggie said. Now, the school. Your letter mentioned it's been without a teacher for 14 months. I'd like to see it today if possible, and understand what we're working with. Finch went on staring at her for a moment more. Then something happened in his expression. The adjustment that happens when a person revises their expectation of someone and finds the revision is necessary in an upward direction. Of course, he said. I'll take you there myself. The school was a single room at the east end of the main street, and it was as Harold Finch had described in his letters in need of attention. 14 months of disuse had done to it. What disuse does to anything. The roof had a soft spot in the northwest corner. 2 of the window frames had warped and wouldn't open properly. Several of the benches were loose-legged or cracked, and there was a family of mice living behind the wood stove that had made themselves extremely comfortable. Maggie walked through it slowly. She ran her hand along the top of the teacher's desk. She examined the slates, 7 of them varying degrees of cracked to whole. She opened the cabinet beside the door and found 3 books, a half box of chalk, and a set of reading primers, so old the covers were no longer the same color as they'd started. How many children? She asked. 18 enrolled, Finch said from the doorway. He was watching her with an expression that had moved from cautious to something closer to hope. Ages 6 to 14. They've been falling behind badly. Some of the older ones are starting to think there's no point. There's always a point, Maggie said. She closed the cabinet. I'll need supplies. I brought my own primers, which will help. I'll need chalk, more slates if we can get them, and the roof needs to be repaired before the weather turns. She turned to face him. The mice I'll handle myself. Finch laughed a surprised, genuine laugh. Miss Collins, he said, I believe we made the right choice. Maggie accepted that with a nod and went back to looking at the stove. She was not going to tell Harold Finch that her hands were still unsteady from the cold of the night before, or that she had eaten exactly 2 biscuits in the past 24 hours and was genuinely lightheaded, or that when she had looked at herself in Mrs. Aldridge's mirror that morning, she had thought for just a moment about how far she was from everything she knew. She was going to look at this school and figure out what it needed. That was what she did. It was how she stayed standing. Word moved through Willow Creek. The way word always moved through a small town, not by any single deliberate act, but by a kind of collective breath information, passing from person to person with the naturalness of weather. By noon, most of the town knew that the new school teacher had arrived a day late after being abandoned by the stage driver at the junction and had spent the night there and come in with Nathan Reed. This last part was subject to considerable interpretation. Most of the interpretations were wrong. Maggie became aware of the gossip about 3 hours after arriving when she walked into the general store for the second time that morning, and the conversation in progress stopped with the particular abruptness of a conversation that has been about the person who just walked in. 2 women near the dry goods counter looked at her with expressions that were just one shade past curious. A man she didn't know nodded at her from near the door with something in his nod that had judgment in it. The store owner, a wide man named Gus Parton, gave her a smile that was one half genuine and one half wondering what story he was looking at. Maggie bought her chalk and 2 pounds of cornmeal and a box of matches and asked about getting more slates, and she kept her voice even and she ignored everything else. She was almost to the door when one of the women near the dry goods counter said, not quite quietly enough, "Well, I suppose Nathan had to do something with her. He couldn't exactly leave her there." Maggie stopped. She turned around. The woman who had spoken was perhaps 45, well-dressed by Willow Creek standards, with the expression of someone who considers it a public service to say what others are thinking. "My name is Margaret Collins," Maggie said. "I am the new school teacher. I was left at the junction by a stage driver who chose not to honor my ticket, and I was helped into town by a man who passed by and understood the difference between someone who doesn't need help and someone who does. I am grateful to Mr. Reed for that. And I would appreciate it very much if going forward you held the town's opinions about the circumstances of my arrival until you have had the chance to form an opinion about the quality of my teaching." The store went quiet. The woman looked at her with an expression that had moved several stops past surprise. Gus Parton behind the counter made a sound that was not quite a laugh and turned to look at something on the shelf behind him. Maggie walked out. She stood for a moment in the street with her purchases breathing the morning air, and she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of something that was not quite triumph, because it was too complicated to be a simple thing. Then she went back to the school and started on the mice. She was still at the school at 4 in the afternoon when she heard boots on the step outside. She assumed it was Finch coming to check on her progress. She was on her knees beside the wood stove, having removed the back panel, and her hands were not in a state she would normally choose to be seen in, but Finch was going to have to get used to the fact that his new school teacher was a person who dealt with problems directly. "Miss Collins." It was not Finch. Maggie sat back on her heels and looked over her shoulder. Nathan Reed was standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse with his hat in his hands, which surprised her. It was the kind of gesture that took something from a man taking the hat off, and she hadn't expected it. "Mr. Reed," she said, "I heard you were at the school." He glanced at the panel she'd removed from the stove. "You're fixing the stove." "I'm evicting the previous tenants." She stood and wiped her hands on the cloth she'd been using. "Is there something you needed?" He turned the hat in his hands. "Just once. I wanted to make sure you were all right, after last night." "I'm fine," Maggie said. "I know you are," he said. "I could see that. I just wanted to say so, in the daylight, where you could see my face when I said it." She looked at him. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "And a proper one. What I said in the wagon wasn't enough." Maggie folded the cleaning cloth and set it down on the nearest bench. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Reed. You gave me a ride. I thanked you." "You thanked me because you'd been raised to thank people," Nathan said, "even when you were angry at them." He paused. "I picked you up without your permission. I put my hands on a woman I didn't know and moved her without asking. That was wrong, even if the reason behind it was decent. I should have said that last night, and I didn't, and I've been thinking about it all day." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "You said it now," she said. "I did. You could have not said it at all. Most people wouldn't have." "I'm not most people," Nathan said. There was nothing boastful in the way he said it. It was just a statement of what he knew to be true about himself. Said plainly, the way a man says something he has long since stopped needing to prove. Maggie looked at him in the afternoon light coming through the warped window frames. She thought about what the woman in Gus Parton's store had said. He couldn't exactly leave her there. As if what Nathan had done was the result of having no other option. As if it was the least a person could do, not a choice worth respecting. She didn't believe that. She believed from looking at Nathan Reed in the daylight, where she could see his face, that he was a man who had made a deliberate choice and was standing in her schoolhouse in the afternoon, willing to be accountable for it, and that was not nothing. "All right," she said. "Then we're settled, Mr. Reed." "Nathan," he said, "if that's all right." "Nathan," she said, "I'm Maggie." He nodded. He put his hat back on. I was almost to the door when he paused and turned back, and she saw something move across his face, a decision being made in real time. "For what it's worth," he said, "what you said in Parton's store today, I heard about it." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Word moves fast." "It always does." He paused. "You didn't have to say any of that." "I know," Maggie said. "But you did." "I did." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was quieter than anything she had expected from him. Then he nodded once and walked out. Maggie stood in the middle of the schoolroom for a long moment after he left. She became aware in the aftermath of that conversation that her pulse was slightly elevated. She considered this piece of information with the same practicality she brought to all pieces of information, assessed it as irrelevant to anything that needed to be done in the next several weeks, and went back to the stove. There was still work to do. The first week passed, the way first weeks pass in new places, in a blur of logistics and small humiliations and unexpected kindnesses, layered over each other until it was difficult to remember which day each had happened on. Maggie opened the school on her fourth day in Willow Creek. 18 children. Exactly as Finch had said. Ages 6 to 14 in one room with one teacher and 7 slates and 3 textbooks and a stove that now functioned correctly because Maggie had spent an entire evening rebuilding its firebox seal with materials she'd sourced from the blacksmith. A taciturn man named Earl Hobbs, who had watched her work and said nothing for 20 minutes before handing her a better tool than the one she'd been using. The children were wary. They had had 3 teachers in 4 years, all of whom had stayed less than a season, and they had learned not to invest too much in someone new. Maggie understood that instinctively because she had been a child who did the same thing for different reasons. She didn't try to win them. She just taught. She taught as if this were the 3rd month, not the first day. She taught as if they were capable of more than they'd been given credit for. She asked questions and waited for the answers, and when the answers were wrong, she said, "Not quite, let's think about it again," without the tone that made a child wish they had never tried. By the end of the first week, 4 of the older students, 3 boys and a girl of 12 named Clara, who turned out to have a mind like a steel trap and a distrust of adults that was almost professional, were voluntarily staying after the official close of the school day to work through problems she'd set. Clara was the one who changed things. On the Friday of the first week, Clara was waiting outside the school door when Maggie arrived in the morning. "Teacher," she said. "Clara," Maggie said. "Billy Crane told the boys at the mill that your school wasn't going to last," Clara said. "He said the last 3 teachers left before winter, and you'd probably do the same." "Billy Crane," Maggie said, "doesn't know me." "I know," Clara said. "That's what I told him." Maggie looked at this 12-year-old girl with her direct eyes and her folded arms, and the particular expression of someone who has appointed herself a defender of something she's not entirely sure is worth defending yet, and she felt something shift in her chest. "Thank you, Clara," she said. "I didn't do it for you," Clara said quickly. "I did it because I'm tired of people deciding things are going to fail before they've actually failed." "So am I," Maggie said. They went inside. That afternoon, when Maggie was carrying an armload of the new slates she'd managed to source from the next town, paid for out of her own first week's wages, because the school board budget was, as Finch had apologized, at length extremely limited, she turned a corner and walked directly into a solid wall of human being. The slates went one direction, she went another. 2 hands caught her before she hit the ground. She was upright again before she'd fully registered falling, standing in the middle of the street with her arms steadied and her heart in her throat, and Nathan Reed looking down at her with an expression that was somewhere between startled and something more complicated. "I've got you," he said. "You all right?" His hands were on her arms, holding her steady, and it was different from the night in the wagon. This was daylight. This was accidental. This was both of them in motion, and him simply reacting faster than gravity. She was aware of the steadiness of his grip in a way that was difficult to ignore. "I'm fine," she said. "I was carrying." "I see." He bent down and started gathering the slates before she could. "These for the school?" "Yes." He stacked them carefully, checked each one for cracks. 3 had new chips from the fall. He held them up for her to see. "I can take these to Earl," he said. "He might be able to edge them so they're still usable." "You don't have to do that." "I know." He handed her the undamaged ones and kept the 3 damaged slates. "I'm going past the smithy anyway." Maggie stood on the street holding an armful of slates and watched him walk in the direction of the blacksmith. She became aware that 3 women standing outside the dry goods store were watching this exchange with considerable attention. One of them was the woman from Parton's store. Maggie straightened her back and continued toward the school. That evening, Nathan delivered the 3 slates to the schoolhouse. Earl had edged them clean, no wasted surface. He had also apparently on his own initiative reinforced the wooden frames. Nathan handed them to her at the schoolhouse door. "Tell Earl thank you," Maggie said. "He knows." A pause stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but aware of itself. "Finch said you've got a waiting list," Nathan said. "Children whose families want them enrolled, but you don't have room." "5 names," Maggie said. "I'm trying to figure out a schedule that allows me to work with the younger children in the morning and the older ones in the afternoon with some overlap. If it works, I can take the 5 additional students." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "There's a room at the back of the feed store that's not being used. Dobie wouldn't charge much for it. Second location alternating days." Maggie stared at him. "You've already talked to Dobie." "I mentioned it might be useful," Nathan said. "Nothing's decided. It's your call." "Why?" Maggie said. "Why do you keep—" She stopped. She started again. "You fixed the wagon. You brought the slates to Earl. You talked to Dobie. Why?" Nathan looked at her steadily. "Because you're doing something this town needs," he said, "and you're doing it with less than you should have, and I know what that looks like." "It looks like most people's lives," Maggie said. "Yes," Nathan said. "It does." Something in the straightforwardness of that answer made it harder to deflect than a compliment would have been. A compliment she could have waved off. This was something else. This was a man looking at the actual shape of her situation and acknowledging it without dressing it up. She didn't know quite what to do with that. "I'll talk to Dobie," she said. "Good," Nathan said. He left, and this time, Maggie stood in the doorway and watched him go. And the evening light was doing something particular to the street and the buildings and the space he moved through, and she stood there watching until he turned the corner and was gone, and then she closed the door and stood inside her school in the quiet. She was here. She had built something in 8 days that she could point to. She was not going home. Whatever else was true about Nathan Reed and his quiet attentiveness and his hands that had caught her before she fell, she was not going home. She sat down at the teacher's desk and began planning next week's lessons. Around her the school was quiet, and the slates were stacked by the window, and the stove held a low fire, and the mice were gone, and 12 years old, Clara's name was written at the top of the attendance sheet in Maggie's best handwriting. The school teacher was staying. That fact, planted in the hard ground of Willow Creek's skepticism, had already begun to change the town in ways too small to name yet, but too certain to stop. And in a ranch house on the north edge of town, a man who trusted horses more than people sat at a kitchen table that had been empty for 11 years and thought for reasons he couldn't fully account for about slates and determined eyes, and a woman who had said, "I'm fine in 16 different ways," since he'd known her and meant it every time. He didn't put a name to what he was thinking. But he sat at that table longer than he usually did, and when he finally went to bed, the house felt for the first time in a long time like something more than just a place to sleep. Part 3. The storm that revealed their hearts. The first sign that something was wrong came from Clara. She showed up at the schoolhouse door on a Thursday morning before any of the other children arrived, and she had that look she got when she'd already decided something was going to happen and was trying to figure out how to stop it. Maggie had learned to read Clara's face the way she read weather. The girl was almost never wrong, and she never alarmed without reason. "What is it?" Maggie said. "Mrs. Calloway's son told my brother that Mr. Hargrove is coming today," Clara said. Maggie set down the chalk she'd been holding. "Who is Mr. Hargrove?" "He owns half the cattle south of town, and he donated the money for the roof repair last spring." Clara folded her arms the way she did when delivering information she considered dangerous. "He's on the school committee." "All right," Maggie said. And his daughter is 14, and she's been enrolled here for 3 weeks, but she's only come twice." Clara looked at her directly. "Because her mother doesn't think she needs schooling past what she already knows. But Mr. Hargrove pays, so he expects things a certain way." "What way?" Maggie said. "The way where the teacher doesn't tell his daughter she got the wrong answer in front of everybody." Maggie remembered that moment. 2 weeks ago. Dorothea Hargrove, 14, confident in the casual way of someone who had never been seriously challenged, had stated in front of the class that the Missouri River ran south to north. Maggie had said calmly that it did not, and had asked if anyone could correct the direction. Clara had answered immediately. Dorothea had not come back the following week. "I see," Maggie said. "He's going to ask you to apologize to her," Clara said, "or he's going to complain to Mr. Finch and try to get you removed." Maggie picked up her chalk again. "Thank you, Clara. Go sit down." "Don't you want to, I don't know, prepare something?" "I'm always prepared," Maggie said. "Sit down." Hargrove arrived at 10:30, which Maggie noted was precisely when she was in the middle of teaching the older students long division, and the younger ones were working quietly on their letters. It was, she suspected, not an accidental time to arrive. The middle of a lesson was harder to interrupt cleanly than the beginning or end, and a man who wanted to assert authority would know that. How was a large man? Not fat, just large. The kind of large that came from decades of outdoor work and a general belief that the world was arranged for his convenience. He came through the door without knocking, looked around the room with the expression of a man assessing property, and then looked at Maggie. "Miss Collins." Every child in the room looked up. "Mr. Hargrove," Maggie said, "we're in the middle of a lesson. If you'd like to speak with me, I'll be available at noon." "I'd like to speak with you now." The room was completely silent. 18 children watching. Maggie was aware of every one of them, especially the older students, especially Clara, especially the 3 boys in the back, who were at the age where they were learning from every interaction what authority looked like and how it moved. She kept her voice entirely level. "I understand, and I'll be happy to give you my full attention at noon. Right now these children are working, and I won't interrupt that." Hargrove's jaw tightened. He was not a man who was told to wait. 5 minutes, he said. "Noon," Maggie said. "Clara, will you read the next problem aloud for the class, please?" Clara, without missing a beat, picked up her slate and read the problem in a clear, steady voice. Hargrove stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he left. The room let out a breath it had been holding collectively. Maggie did not let herself exhale until she heard his boots off the steps. At noon, she met him on the school step. She did not invite him inside because the inside of the school was where her students had been sitting, and she wasn't going to have that conversation in their space. Hargrove didn't waste time. "My daughter was embarrassed in front of the class." "Your daughter gave an incorrect answer," Maggie said. "I corrected it without drawing further attention to it. That's how learning works." "She's been educated by private tutors," he said. "She doesn't need to be corrected by—" He stopped. "By what, Mr. Hargrove?" Maggie said. The pause was exactly long enough to contain everything he'd decided not to say. "By a public school teacher," he finished. "Then perhaps she shouldn't be enrolled in a public school," Maggie said. "That would be your decision to make. But while Dorothea is in my classroom, she will be held to the same standard as every other student. Not because I disrespect her, but because I respect her enough to expect accuracy." Hargrove stared at her. "I donate to this school," he said. "I know," Maggie said. "And I'm grateful for that. The roof held up last week when we had rain, and that's partly due to your contribution. But donations don't purchase different rules for different children." The silence between them was the kind that had consequences. Hargrove put his hat on. He'd been holding it, which she noted, and he looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite respect, but was moving in that direction with considerable reluctance. "My wife wants an apology," he said. "I understand," Maggie said. "What does Dorothea want?" That stopped him. He clearly had not asked. After a moment he said, "I'll be speaking to Finch." "I'd expect nothing less," Maggie said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hargrove." She went back inside. She sat at the teacher's desk for approximately 45 seconds, breathing very carefully, before she stood up and started preparing the afternoon lesson. When Nathan heard about it, and of course he heard about it because Willow Creek and the story of Maggie Collins. Sending Hargrove away from the schoolhouse door had covered the entire town by supper time. He showed up at the school the following morning before classes. She was rearranging the bench order, trying to find a configuration that let the younger children see the board without blocking the older students. "I heard about Hargrove," Nathan said from the doorway. "I imagine most people did," Maggie said, not stopping what she was doing. "He's talking to Finch today." "I know. He has real influence in this town, Maggie." She stopped. She turned and looked at him. "I know that too. What do you think I should have done differently?" Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to make sure you knew what you were walking into. I've been walking into rooms where people had already decided what they thought of me my entire life." Maggie said, "I'm not afraid of Hargrove." "I know you're not," Nathan said. "That's not what worries me." She looked at him more carefully. "Then what does—" He came into the room a few steps. He picked up one end of the bench she'd been moving and shifted it into the position she'd been angling it toward. "There are people in this town who want you to fail," he said. "Not because of anything you've done, because of what you represent." "A woman who doesn't know her place," Maggie said. "A woman who's better at the job than anyone they'd hire to replace you," Nathan said quietly, "which is more threatening than the first thing." She sat down on the bench he'd just moved. That was not what she'd expected him to say. "Finch will back you," Nathan said. "He's seen what you've done in 3 weeks, but I wanted you to know if he doesn't." He stopped, started again. "I'll go with you to that meeting." Maggie looked up at him. "Nathan, I don't need—" "I know you don't need it," he said. "I'm offering it." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Why?" she said, not challenging, genuinely asking. The question sat in the air between them. Nathan looked at the bench, then at her. "Because what's happening to you is wrong," he said. "And I have standing in this town, and standing doesn't mean anything if you only use it for yourself." Maggie looked at her hands in her lap. She had been standing alone for so long, not just in Willow Creek, not just since the junction, but for years before that in Ohio, in her mother's house, after her mother died in the school board offices, where men with kind smiles told her she wasn't quite what they were looking for. That she had built aloneness into the architecture of herself. She had built it so well that she sometimes forgot it was a structure she'd constructed, not simply who she was. Having someone offer to stand beside her felt inconveniently like something she did not have a prepared response for. "The meeting is at 2, she said. "I'll be here at 1:30, Nathan said. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the desk and walked out. The meeting with Finch and Hargrove lasted 40 minutes. Nathan sat in the back of the hall without saying a single word. He didn't need to. His presence was its own statement, and everyone in that room understood it. Nathan Reed, who donated the largest annual sum to the town's infrastructure, who employed 6 men on his ranch, who had been part of Willow Creek's fabric for 11 years, had chosen to be in that room behind the schoolteacher. Finch backed Maggie completely. Hargrove left with his objection noted and unresolved, which was the best outcome Maggie had expected, and a better one than she'd feared. Walking out, Nathan fell into step beside her on the boardwalk. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't need me," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it was easier with you there." He glanced at her sideways, and she caught it, and something moved quickly across the surface of that moment, like a fish beneath clear water, present and visible and gone, before either of them could name it. 3 days later, the sky changed. It came in from the northwest, the way the worst Montana storms did, without much warning. A wall of dark that moved faster than the light was retreating, and by mid-morning, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the wind was coming in hard enough to find every gap in the schoolhouse walls. Maggie kept teaching. She kept teaching through the first hour of rain when it was loud on the roof, and the younger children were frightened, and she gathered the 6 youngest on the bench nearest the stove, and had Clara read to them from the primer, while Maggie helped the older students with their arithmetic, and watched the northwest corner of the ceiling with one eye. The northwest corner had been soft. She'd asked Finch about it twice. He'd said it was on the list. The list had not been addressed. At 11:30, the corner gave. Not catastrophically, it didn't fall in. It simply opened a seam wide enough that rain began coming through in a thin, persistent curtain that landed directly on the shelf where the books were. Maggie moved the books in under 4 minutes. Every primer, every reader, every textbook she'd brought from Ohio, and every one she'd sourced since arriving, stacked on the teacher's desk, and the two highest benches, and covered with her own coat, and the emergency canvas she'd stored beside the stove for exactly this kind of contingency. "Everyone to the south wall," she said with the particular quality of voice she'd developed for moments when calm was the most important thing she could offer. 18 children moved. The rain increased. The seam in the roof widened. Maggie looked at the door and then at the children and did the calculation. The boarding house was 4 buildings down and across the street. In this rain, with this wind, moving 18 children ranging in age from 6 to 14 was possible, but not without risk. The youngest 3 couldn't walk fast enough. The street would be mud and running water by now. She went to the door and looked out. The street was mud and running water. She came back in. "We're staying," she said to Clara, who was the only one old enough to have understood the door check. "It's safer here than out there. Keep reading." Clara looked at the ceiling. "The whole thing is going to come in." "No, it isn't," Maggie said. "It's one corner. I'm going to deal with it." She dealt with it the way she dealt with everything, directly, and without waiting for someone else to have a better idea. She found the canvas that had been stored behind the stove, got up on the teacher's desk, and wedged one edge of it into the ceiling gap, and weighted the other end across 2 bench backs to create a slope that directed the water toward the back wall instead of onto the floor. It was not elegant. It worked. The children watched her with the expressions of people revising their assessment of a situation. Nathan came through the door at noon. He was soaked to the bone. He stood in the doorway, taking in the room, the children against the south wall. Clara reading aloud. Maggie on the desk, making adjustments to the canvas angle with an expression that went through several stages quickly. "I heard the roof was in," he said. "It's managed," Maggie said from the desk. "Get down from there. I'm almost—" "Maggie." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not commanding. Closer to afraid. "Please get down from that desk." She got down. He crossed the room and looked up at the canvas arrangement. He stood there for a moment, and she watched him understand what she'd done, how it worked, why it worked, the chain of problem-solving decisions that had produced it. He turned to her. "Are the children all right?" "Everyone's fine. No one's hurt." He looked at her. She was damp from the ceiling leak, but not soaked, because she had been moving fast enough that no single spot had gotten the worst of it. She realized now, been holding herself together with the same set of mechanisms she'd been running on since the junction. The part of her that simply didn't stop until stopping was allowed. Nathan saw it. She didn't know how, but he saw it. He turned to the room. "All right, everyone. Is there a Billy here? Billy Marsh?" A boy of about 10 raised his hand from the south wall. "Your daddy's outside with his wagon. He's going to take the littlest ones home. The rest of you—" He looked at Maggie. "The rest of you will wait here," Maggie said, "until someone comes for you or the rain breaks. Clara, keep reading. The arithmetic problems on the board are due before you leave." There was a collective sound that might have been protest and might have been relief. In the controlled movement of children toward the door and into the waiting wagon outside, Nathan ended up beside Maggie at the back of the room. The older students were bent over their slates. Clara was reading. The rain on the roof was steady and loud. "You've been here all morning with 18 children and a leaking roof," Nathan said low enough that only she could hear. "Yes," Maggie said. "By yourself. That's generally what it means to be the teacher." Maggie. Something in the way. He said her name made her stop arranging the books she'd been stacking. She looked at him. And something in her face must have shifted, because he reached out and put his hand briefly on her arm. Not a grip, not the steadying hold from the street collision, just a light touch present and gone, and said quietly, "You don't always have to hold everything by yourself." She opened her mouth. She closed it. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not cry now. But something moved behind her eyes that she had to actively manage, and she was aware that managing it in front of Nathan Reed was harder than managing it in front of anyone else had ever been. "I know," she said. Her voice was steady. She made sure of it. "I know that." He nodded. I went to help with the canvas arrangement, adding 2 additional weights that made the slope more efficient, and she watched his hands work and thought about how he'd come through a storm to check on a building that wasn't his, and children that weren't his, and a woman who hadn't asked him to. After the last child was collected, and the room was empty except for the 2 of them, and the steady rain and the sound of water moving in the canvas channel, Maggie sat down on the nearest bench and let herself be still for the first time since 11:30. Nathan sat down across from her. Not close, not far, just present. They sat in the quiet of the storm for a moment that was doing something to the air between them that neither of them was quite ready to look at directly. Then Nathan said, "There's something I should probably tell you." She looked up. "The woman I was going to marry," he said, "8 years ago." He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without staging it for effect. And yet Maggie felt the weight of it. "Her name was Louise," he said. "She came out here from St. Louis. She was striking, educated. She had ideas about what the frontier was going to be, and she stayed long enough for those ideas to collide with what it actually was." Maggie waited. "She left in the spring of our 2nd year," Nathan said. "She told me I was a good man, but that she needed a life that was more than cattle and fence lines and winters that lasted too long." He paused. "She wasn't wrong about what she needed. She was just wrong about what she told me it meant." "What did she tell you it meant?" Maggie said. "That I wasn't enough," Nathan said. "Not in those words, but that was the shape of it." The rain came down. "After she left," he said, "I built the ranch up, bigger, more productive. I told myself I was doing it because it was good business, which was true. But I was also doing it because I needed something I could point to that was unambiguously enough, something no one could leave." He looked at his hands. "You can't build something a person can't leave," Maggie said quietly. "No," Nathan said. "You can't." A long moment passed. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He looked up at her. "Because I've been showing up here for 3 weeks, and I think you deserve to know why." The rain was very loud on the roof. "Why?" she said. Nathan looked at her with an expression that was the most unguarded thing she had seen on his face. "Because you're the first person I've met since Louise who made me think that being enough might actually be possible again," he said. "And I wanted you to know that before you heard some half-accurate version of it from someone else in this town." Maggie sat with that. She sat with it the way she sat with the things that required actual consideration. Still hands quiet, not filling the silence with words that would let her avoid the center of it. "Nathan," she said, "I need to tell you something too." He waited. "There was a man in Ohio," she said. "He was kind to me for almost 2 years. I believed that he saw me. Not," she paused, "not what I look like. Me. And then he told me he cared for me very much, but that his position required him to consider how his wife would be received." She said it evenly. He used the word received. Nathan's jaw tightened. "I understood what he meant," Maggie said. "And I left. But the thing that stayed with me wasn't the loss of him. It was that I had believed for 2 years that someone truly saw me, and finding out I was wrong about that." She stopped. "What?" Nathan said. "It made me afraid to believe it again," she said, "even when the evidence suggests I should." The silence between them had changed quality. It was no longer simply the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had gotten used to each other. It was the silence of something being said that couldn't be unsaid. Nathan looked at her. "I see you, Maggie," he said. "I know you don't have a reason to believe that yet. I'm not asking you to. I'm just telling you it's true." Outside, the rain was beginning to ease. Inside the schoolhouse, the canvas channel was doing its job, and the books were safe, and the fire in the stove was still going, and 2 people were sitting across from each other in the particular way that people sit when they have just handed each other something breakable and are waiting to see if the other person's hands are steady. Neither of them looked away. And then the door opened. Harold Finch came in at a near run, wet through, slightly wild-eyed. "Good Lord, Miss Collins, I just heard about the roof, are you?" He stopped. He took in the room, the canvas, the dry books, the stove, The two people sitting on the benches looking at him with the expressions of people who had been interrupted. "Everything is under control," Maggie said. Finch looked at the ceiling arrangement. He looked at Nathan. He looked at Maggie. "I see that," he said. His voice had changed slightly. Yes, I see that." He cleared his throat. "Miss Collins, I came to tell you something. I'd planned to speak to you after the storm, but given the circumstances." "What is it?" Maggie said. Finch took off his wet hat. He turned it in his hands. "We received a communication this week from the Territorial Education Board," he said. "They're reorganizing the district. Larger schools better funded in the main towns." He paused. "They've offered you a position. Head teacher at the new school in Helena. Full salary. Staff of 4. The room went still. Maggie did not move. She was aware in a distant way of Nathan sitting very still across from her. "Helena," she said. "It's a significant offer," Finch said. "I won't pretend it isn't. The salary alone is 3 times what we're paying you here. The facilities are established. You'd have resources here that I can't provide." The rain had stopped. In the sudden quiet of its absence, the dripping from the canvas seemed very loud. Maggie looked at the books she'd stacked on the desk. She looked at the slates by the window, including the 3 that Earl had edged for her, the ones that had been damaged when she'd collided with Nathan in the street. She looked at the bench arrangement she'd spent 2 weeks perfecting. She looked at the board where Clara's handwriting was still visible in the problems she'd written before the storm. She did not look at Nathan. "When do they need an answer?" she said. "End of the month," Finch said. 3 weeks. He looked between them once more with the expression of a man who understood he had walked into the middle of something and wasn't sure what it was. "I'll leave you to that. I'll see to the roof repairs first thing tomorrow." He put his hat back on. "Good evening, Miss Collins. Nathan." He left. The door closed. Maggie and Nathan sat in the empty schoolhouse in the aftermath of everything the afternoon had contained, and the silence between them now had a different weight than it had had before Finch walked in. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks to decide whether Willow Creek was a way station or a destination. She had not looked at Nathan when Finch said Helena. She did not look at him now, but she was aware of him. The way you are aware of the only other source of warmth in a cold room. Not because you've decided to be, but because the body knows what it knows before the mind catches up. "You should consider it," Nathan said. His voice was very quiet. "I intend to," Maggie said. She stood up. She began putting the books back on the shelf, and Nathan stood and helped her, and neither of them said another word, and the not saying was its own language, and both of them were fluent in it, and every book that went back on that shelf was a second that passed without the conversation. Neither of them was ready to have. Outside, Willow Creek was picking itself up after the storm. Voices in the street. Horses moving. The particular sounds of a town returning to itself. Inside the school, 2 people put books on a shelf in silence. And somewhere in that silence, between the water still dripping from the canvas, and the fire settling low in the stove, and the last gray light coming through the warped window frames, something was being decided that neither of them had yet put into words. Part 4. Choosing love without losing herself. The letter from Helena sat on the corner of Maggie's desk for 6 days without being opened a second time. She had read it once the night Finch delivered it, sitting at the teacher's desk with the lamp turned up and the school empty around her. She had read every line carefully the way she read everything, not for what it said on the surface, but for what it meant underneath. Then she had folded it back into its envelope and set it in the corner of the desk, and had not touched it since. The children noticed. Clara noticed most. On the 7th morning, Clara arrived early again. It had become a pattern, the girl showing up before the others with something to say that she hadn't figured out how to say during school hours, and she stood in the doorway looking at the letter on the desk, and then at Maggie. "You're thinking about leaving," Clara said. "I'm thinking about a decision," Maggie said. "Those are different things." "Are they?" Maggie looked at her. 12 years old, with eyes that saw too clearly for someone who hadn't had enough years yet to know what to do with that kind of sight. "Yes," Maggie said. "They are. Thinking about a decision means you haven't made it. It means you're taking it seriously enough to actually consider all of it." "What's all of it?" Clara said. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sit down, Clara." Clara sat. "When I was your age," Maggie said, "there was a teacher who told me I was smart enough to do anything I decided to do. That was the first time any adult had said that to me in a way I believed, and I never forgot it because it changed what I thought was possible." She paused. "That's what this job is. That's what I came here to do." "So you're not leaving?" "I didn't say that." Maggie looked at the letter. "I said that's what the job is. The question is where to do it." Clara's jaw tightened in the particular way it did when she was working hard, not to say what she actually felt. "Helena's bigger," she said. "More students, more money." "Yes." "And you'd have other teachers. You wouldn't have to do everything yourself." "Yes." "So it's better," Clara said with the flat delivery of someone presenting an argument they don't want to win. "On paper," Maggie said. "What's not on paper?" Clara said. Maggie looked at her for a long moment. "You, Guy," she said simply. "And Billy. And the Marsh boys. And 14 other children who have been let down by adults leaving before the work was finished." She folded her hands on the desk. "That's not on paper, and it matters." Clara looked at the floor. Her jaw worked. She pressed her lips together in the way she did when something had gotten past the defenses she'd spent years building. "I didn't ask you to stay for me," she said. "I know you didn't," Maggie said. "You'd never ask anyone for anything. You're too busy making sure you don't need to." She paused. "That's something I understand, Clara. Better than you think." The girl was quiet. Outside, the first of the other children were beginning to arrive, their voices carrying through the door. Clara stood up. She straightened her dress. She picked up her slate. "Whatever you decide," she said carefully, looking somewhere to the left of Maggie's face. "I think you're the best teacher I've ever had." Then she went to her bench before Maggie could respond. Maggie sat for a moment with that sentence. Then she stood up, turned to the board, and wrote the first problem of the day. The town was watching her, and she knew it. Willow Creek had a way of making its attention known not loudly but persistently, the way a low fire makes a room warm, whether you're looking at it or not. People asked careful questions at Parton's store. Mrs. Aldridge mentioned twice in the carefully casual way of someone mentioning something very deliberately that the boarding house had a long-term rate that was quite reasonable. Even Earl Hobbs, who had never voluntarily initiated conversation with Maggie in her 6 weeks in Willow Creek, looked up from his forge when she passed and said without preamble, "Hope you're staying." She had said, "I'm considering it, Earl." He had nodded and gone back to his work, and that was the whole of it, and somehow it meant as much as anything more articulate would have. Nathan said nothing. This was the thing she turned over most often in the hours when she wasn't teaching or repairing something or writing lesson plans by lamplight. Nathan, who had shown up at every moment when showing up, mattered, who had sat across from her in the storm-quiet schoolhouse and told her things he clearly hadn't told anyone, who had said, "I see you," in the plainest voice she'd ever heard. Those words said in Nathan was saying nothing about Helena. He came by the school twice in those first 6 days. Once to check that the roof repair was holding. Once to bring a box of chalk that Parton had set aside. Apparently Nathan had mentioned to the store owner that the school was running low. Both times he was practical, present, and entirely quiet on the subject of letters from the Territorial Education Board. On the 7th evening, Maggie went to find him. She had never been to the Reed Ranch. She knew where it was, everyone in Willow Creek knew where everything was, and she walked the 1.5 miles in the cooling evening air with her coat buttoned and her purpose clear, which was the only way she knew how to do anything that frightened her. Nathan was at the fence line near the barn when she arrived. He saw her coming from 50 yards out and went still, the way animals go still when they register something unexpected in their territory. Not alarmed, just attentive, recalibrating. He was holding a section of wire when she reached him. "Maggie," he said. "Why haven't you said anything?" she said. "About Helena." He set the wire down on the fence post. "What would you want me to say?" "I don't know. That's partly why I'm here." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you want me to say?" "The truth," Maggie said. whatever that is. Nathan was quiet. A horse moved in the paddock behind him. He looked at the fence line, then back at her. "The truth is, I don't think it's my place to tell you what to do with your life," he said. "The truth is, Helena is a better opportunity than Willow Creek on every practical measure I can think of, and you've worked hard enough that you deserve every practical advantage available." He paused. "And the truth is, I've been sitting in that kitchen every night this week trying to figure out how to say those things without also saying the other thing, and I haven't managed it yet." "Say the other thing," Maggie said. He looked at her directly. "I don't want you to go," he said. "Not because I think this town needs you more than Helena does. Not because I think you'd be making a mistake. But because—" He stopped. He picked the wire back up, set it down again. It was the most she had ever seen Nathan Reed be unsettled. "Because you're the first thing in 11 years that's made this ranch feel like somewhere I actually want to come home to. And that's not a fair thing to tell someone who's trying to make a decision about their own life. So I've been keeping it." Maggie stood very still. The evening air moved around them. "Nathan," she said, "look at me." He did. "I am not Louise," she said. His jaw tightened. "I am not going to leave because the winters are long," she said. "I am not going to leave because ranch life is hard. I grew up knowing hard. Hard is not what scares me." "What scares you?" he said quietly. "Disappearing," she said. "I've watched women disappear into marriages, into houses, into other people's needs. They become invisible, to themselves first, and then to everyone else." She held his gaze. "I will not do that. Not for anyone." "I would never ask you to," Nathan said. "I know," Maggie said. "I believe you. But believing you means I need to say it out loud what I need. Not as a warning, as a truth." She took a breath. "I will teach. Whatever happens wherever I am, I will teach. That's not negotiable." "It shouldn't be," Nathan said. "I will make decisions about this school, about curriculum, about which children need what. I won't ask permission for those decisions. Nor should you. And I will not be someone's kept woman, Nathan. Not on a ranch, not anywhere." "Maggie," Nathan said, and his voice had gone very quiet. "I am standing in front of you telling you that I want you to stay because you make this place feel like a home. I am not standing here asking you to become smaller." The words landed in her chest and settled there. She looked at him in the evening light. This man who had lifted her into a wagon without her permission, and then apologized for it in daylight where she could see his face. Who had sat behind her in a town hall meeting without saying a word because his presence said more than words. Who had come through a storm because he'd heard the roof was in and hadn't checked yet whether she needed him, just came anyway. "I haven't decided yet," she said. "I know," Nathan said. "I'm telling you what I need because you told me the truth," she said. "And you deserve the same." "Yes," he said. "I do." They stood at the fence line in the cooling evening, and the horses moved in the paddock, and the first stars were appearing in the east, and neither of them moved toward the other or away. Then Maggie said, "Teach me something about the ranch." Nathan looked at her. "Show me something," she said. "Something real. Something that would actually be my life if I stayed." I was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and picked up the section of fence wire he'd been working with. "This fence runs the perimeter of the east pasture," he said. "It needs checking every week, more often after a storm. A break in the wire means horses getting into the wrong pasture, or predators getting in, or both." He held the wire out to her. "Feel where it's weak." She took the wire. She ran her hands along it, the way he'd shown by example, feeling for the places where the tension was wrong. "Here," she said after a moment. "Yes," Nathan said. "And here." He put his hand beside hers on the wire a few inches further along, and she felt the difference under her fingers. That one would have broken in another week. Maggie looked at the fence wire in her hands, at his hands beside hers. "This is what you do," she said. "Every day. Part of it," Nathan said. "And you love it." It wasn't a question. She could hear it not in anything he'd said, but in the way he'd said the word perimeter, the word pasture. The way a person talks about something they have made themselves responsible for and take seriously. "Yes," he said. Then I understand it better, she said. She handed the wire back to him. She walked back to town in the dark, and she thought about fence wire and weak places, and the difference between a break that's already happened and one that can still be prevented if someone bothers to check. She thought about that for 2 days. On the 9th day, Mrs. Hargrove came to the school. Not Mr. Hargrove. His wife Eleanor, a woman Maggie had seen at church twice, and exchanged nothing more than a nod with a slim, contained woman who gave the impression of someone who had learned to take up exactly as much space as was allocated to her, and no more. She came alone in the middle of the morning, and she knocked on the school door, which was more than her husband had done. Maggie stepped outside to speak with her, leaving Clara in charge of the class with a look that Clara understood and accepted with a slight nod. Eleanor Hargrove stood on the school step with her hands folded and her expression carefully arranged. "Miss Collins," she said. "I'll be brief. I know you're teaching." "Mrs. Hargrove," Maggie said. "Dorothea would like to come back," Eleanor said. "She told me last night." She said. She paused. She looked at something past Maggie's shoulder for a moment. "She said you were the first teacher who treated her like she could be wrong about something, and that she would like to try again." Maggie waited. "My husband doesn't know I'm here," Eleanor said. "I won't mention it," Maggie said. Eleanor looked at her directly for the first time. Up close, she was younger than she seemed from a distance, and there was something in her eyes that Maggie recognized the look of a woman who had been making herself smaller for so long, she'd started to believe it was just her natural size. "She's a bright girl," Eleanor said. "Dorothea. She's been wasted on private tutors who told her she was perfect." "I know," Maggie said. "Send her Monday." Eleanor nodded. She started to turn, then stopped. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I hope you stay. My daughter needs someone to argue with." She walked away. Maggie stood on the school step for a moment. Then she went back inside. That was the second decision, though she didn't name it as such until later. The first was Nathan. The second was Dorothea Hargrove's mother, standing in the cold, saying, "My daughter needs someone to argue with," which was another way of saying that something real was happening here, something that had not existed before Maggie arrived and would not persist in the same form if she left. The third came from the direction she least expected. On the 10th day after Finch delivered the Helena letter, a man arrived in Willow Creek on the afternoon stage, the same stage line Maggie noted that had left her at the junction 3 months ago, though a different driver. He was well-dressed, confident, carrying a leather satchel, and he introduced himself to Harold Finch within an hour of arriving as Mr. George Alcott, representative of the Territorial Education Board. He had come, he said, to discuss the Helena position with Miss Collins directly. Finch brought him to the school at end of day after the children had gone. Alcott was charming. He was well-spoken. He laid out the Helena offer with the practiced ease of a man who was accustomed to making things sound better than refusing them, which was a skill Maggie respected professionally and watched with personal caution. The salary he named was indeed 3 times what Willow Creek paid. The school was new, purpose-built with 4 separate classrooms and a dedicated library. "We've had our eye on your record for some time, Miss Collins," Alcott said. "Your previous work in Ohio is noted, and what you've accomplished here in—" He checked something in his satchel. "8 weeks is it remarkable." "Thank you," Maggie said. "We'd want you to start after Christmas," Alcott said. "That gives you time to wind down your commitment here, find a replacement." "There is no replacement," Maggie said. Alcott paused. "I beg your pardon." "There's no replacement for this school," Maggie said. "There isn't a line of qualified teachers waiting for a one-room schoolhouse in a small Montana town. If I leave, this school goes without a teacher again, the way it was without one for 14 months before I came." Yes, that may be true," Alcott said. "But the Helena position would benefit significantly more children." 18 children, Maggie said. "There are 18 children currently enrolled here, 5 more on the waiting list. 23 children who were falling behind before I arrived and are now moving forward." She paused. "Those children are not abstract. They have names. Clara McGee, Billy Marsh, Dorothea Hargrove, who is coming back to class on Monday." She looked at Alcott directly. "They are not a lesser cause because there are fewer of them." Alcott set his papers on the desk. He looked at her with an expression that had moved from charming to something more honest, which she appreciated. "What would it take," he said, "to convince you that the greater good is in Helena?" "I'm not sure it is," Maggie said. "A large school with a good teacher produces good students. A small community that loses its only teacher produces children who believe they were not worth staying for. Those are different kinds of damage." The room was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this considerably," Alcott said. "I've thought about nothing else for 10 days, Maggie said. Alcott looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his papers, straightened them, put them back in his satchel. "I'm in Willow Creek until Friday," he said. "If you change your mind before then, I'd be grateful to know. If not," he stood, "I'll tell the board that Willow Creek students are fortunate." He left. Finch, who had been standing near the door, looked at Maggie with an expression that contained several things. Relief being the most visible concern for whether she'd made the right choice running beneath it. "Is that a decision?" he said carefully. "Almost," Maggie said. She needed to say one more thing out loud before it became a decision. She found Nathan at the ranch just after supper, and he looked up when she came through the gate with the expression of a man who had been waiting for something without letting himself admit he was waiting. She stopped a few feet from him. "I'm not going to Helena," she said. Nathan was very still. "I need you to understand why," she said. "Because I need you to understand that I'm not staying because of you, and I'm not staying in spite of you." "Tell me," he said. "I'm staying because the work here isn't finished," she said. "Because Clara McGee is 12 years old and the smartest person in this town, and she needs 2 more years of someone who won't let her shrink to fit the space she's been given. Because Dorothea Hargrove has never been told she's capable of being wrong, and that's a cruelty dressed up as a kindness, and I intend to fix it. Because there are 23 children." Her voice caught briefly, and she let it, 23 children who need to believe that someone thought they were worth staying for. Nathan looked at her. "That's why I'm staying," she said. "Maggie," he said. "I'm not finished," she said. "I'm staying for those reasons, and I am also—" She stopped. She made herself continue. "I am also aware that you are here, and that awareness is part of my life in a way it wasn't 2 months ago, and I am not going to pretend it isn't because I've spent too long pretending things aren't true because the truth was inconvenient." Nathan took one step toward her. "I meant what I said at the fence," she said quickly. "I teach. I make my own decisions. I do not disappear." "I know," he said. "I mean it, Nathan." "Maggie." He was very close now. "I know. I heard you the first time, and the second, and I will hear it every time you need to say it. That's not something you have to keep proving." She looked up at him. Something settled in her chest, not the anxious, effortful settling of someone forcing calm, but the real kind. The kind that comes when a person finally stops bracing for impact. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Not in the way you might think I do." "Neither do I," Nathan said. We were young. I was different. I don't know how to do this either." "That's not comforting," Maggie said. "No," he agreed. "But it's honest." She almost laughed. It surprised her, the almost laugh rising up through all the seriousness of the evening. "I'd like to court you properly," Nathan said. "If you'll allow it, Sunday dinners, walks. I'll come to you with my hat in my hand, and I won't assume anything." "You'll come to the school sometimes," she said, "during the week, if something needs fixing." "I will. And you'll tell me when something's wrong at the ranch. You won't manage it alone and let me find out sideways." "I'll try," he said. "That one's harder for me." "I know," she said. "I'll tell you when something's wrong at the school, even when I think I can handle it." "That one's harder for you," he said. "Yes," she said. "We might be more alike than is strictly convenient." This time she did laugh quietly, and Nathan's expression did something that she had not seen it do before. It opened the way a window opens after a long winter, letting out all the stored air. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with grand intention. Just took her hand and held it in the evening air with the horses moving behind them and the first lamps coming on in the distant town. She let him. She did not pull away, and she did not squeeze back immediately, and then she did, and that was everything. The sequence of those small things was everything. They stood there for a while. Neither of them was naive about what came next. There were people in Willow Creek who were not going to be pleased. There was Hargrove, who had never fully stopped being angry. There were the women at Parton's store, who had already written the story of Maggie Collins in their minds, and would need to revise it, which people rarely did gracefully. There was the practical reality of two lives that had been built entirely around individual self-sufficiency, learning to accommodate each other. There was all of that. And underneath all of that, underneath everything that was complicated and uncertain and would require constant tending, the way a fence line required tending, there was this. Two people standing in the evening air holding hands, having told each other the truth. That was the foundation. Everything else could be built on it. Maggie thought about the junction, about the cold road, and the leather suitcase, and the stars coming out one by one above her, indifferent and beautiful, while she sat beside everything she owned and waited for a morning that felt very far away. She thought about the sound of hoofbeats, and a wagon stopping, and a voice that said "ma'am" in the dark. She had not known, sitting at that junction with her chin up and her heart quietly breaking, that the night was not the worst thing that had ever happened to her. She had not known it was the beginning. But that was the thing about beginnings, they didn't announce themselves. They arrived quietly in the dark while you were busy surviving. And sometimes the person who found you in the middle of your worst night was not a complication in the story you were trying to tell. Sometimes he was the story. Fan cuối của Part 4 hiến kết thúc ở đoạn Maggie đồng ý với Nathan tại hàng rào ranch và đoạn suy nghĩ về đây là câu chuyện. Tôi sẽ mở rộng từ điểm đó, viết tiếp liền mạch dài giàu cảm xúc và kịch tính. That was the story. But stories Maggie had learned did not end at the moment of recognition. They continued into the next morning, and the morning after that, and all the ordinary, difficult, beautiful mornings that followed. And it was in those mornings, not in the dramatic moments, not in the storms, or the town hall meetings, or the letters from education boards, that the real work of a life got done. The next morning she woke before dawn the way she always did, and she lay in her room at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house and looked at the ceiling and understood that something had shifted in the architecture of her life so fundamentally that she would need to rearrange everything she had built around the assumption of solitude. She was not afraid of that. She was, if she was honest, something closer to quietly amazed. She got up, she dressed. She went downstairs and found Mrs. Aldridge already at the stove, which was not unusual, and Mrs. Aldridge looked at her face, and whatever she saw there made the older woman set down her coffee pot and turn around fully. "Well," Mrs. Aldridge said. "Good morning," Maggie said. "Don't you good morning me with that face," Mrs. Aldridge said. "That is not a good morning face. That is a something happened face." Maggie sat down at the kitchen table. She folded her hands. She looked at them. "Nathan Reed asked me to marry him," she said. Mrs. Aldridge sat down across from her with the speed of a woman who understood that some conversations required immediate full attention regardless of what else was on the stove. "And," she said. "I said yes," Maggie said. Mrs. Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. Her expression moved through several things: surprise, which was brief because she had clearly seen this coming. Then something warmer. Then something that had the particular quality of relief that comes from watching someone you've quietly worried about find solid ground. "Good," Mrs. Aldridge said. Simply, just that. "You're not going to say anything more than that," Maggie said. "What more is there to say?" Mrs. Aldridge stood back up and went to her stove. "Nathan Reed is a good man who has been lonely for 11 years and didn't know how to stop. You're a good woman who has been doing everything alone for too long and convinced yourself it was strength." She poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them both to the table and sat back down. Two people recognizing each other is not a complicated thing. It just feels complicated because you've both spent a long time being alone, and you've forgotten what it's supposed to feel like. Maggie wrapped her hands around the cup. "What is it supposed to feel like?" she said. Mrs. Aldridge looked at her steadily. "Like you're not carrying everything by yourself anymore," she said. "And like that's not a weakness, just a fact." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "I'm afraid," she said. She had not said that to anyone in years. The word felt strange and honest in her mouth. "Not of Nathan, not of the life. I'm afraid of needing it. Needing him. Needing the thing to be real when I've gotten so good at not needing anything." Mrs. Aldridge nodded slowly. "That's the bravest thing you've said since you arrived in this town," she said. "And you've said some brave things." Maggie looked at her. "Knowing you need something," Mrs. Aldridge said, "and choosing it anyway when you know it could be taken away, that's the real courage. Not the standing up to Hargrove. Not the staying when Alcott offered you a door out. This." She tapped the table once. "Admitting you want the life you're building. That's the one that costs something." Maggie drank her coffee. Outside Willow Creek was beginning to wake up in the slow way of a November morning. The sounds of horses and boot heels on frozen ground and someone's stove being lit, the particular quality of a small town resuming itself after a night's pause. She had 6 weeks ago sat at a junction in the dark and believed no one was coming. She was sitting at a kitchen table in that town now, drinking coffee with a woman who had pulled her in from the cold on her first night, planning a life she had not known was possible when she arrived. The distance between those two moments was not measurable in miles. She finished her coffee and went to school. The week that followed was the strangest of her time in Willow Creek, because it was simultaneously entirely ordinary and quietly extraordinary in the way that weeks are when something has changed at the center of your life and you are still going through the daily motions of the old life while the new one takes shape around you. She taught. She repaired a loose bench leg with a nail she found in the floor and a rock she used as a hammer, which Clara observed with the expression of someone filing away a method for future use. She wrote to the education board regarding supplies. She had a long conversation with Ruth, the second teacher she was lobbying Finch to hire, corresponding by letter with a young woman in Missouri who had written to inquire about the position with a seriousness and specificity that Maggie found immediately promising. She did all of that. And underneath all of that, like a river running beneath familiar ground, was the knowledge that Nathan Reed had asked her to marry him, and she had said yes, and the world had not ended, and in fact showed every sign of continuing quite productively. She told Clara on the Thursday of that week because Clara was going to hear it from someone, and Maggie preferred she hear it first from her. Clara was stacking slates after the other children left, which she did without being asked, which was one of the 1,000 small ways she showed investment in a place she would never have admitted to loving. "I have something to tell you," Maggie said. Clara looked up. "Nathan Reed and I are going to be married." Clara set down the slate she was holding very carefully, as if she needed her hands empty to process information properly. "When?" she said. "Spring, most likely. Does that mean you're leaving the school?" "No," Maggie said. "I'm staying at the school. The ranch is a mile and a half from here. I'll be here every day." Clara picked the slate back up and stacked it. She stacked 2 more. She was clearly doing the thing she did when feeling something she wasn't ready to name, making her hands work so the rest of her could catch up. "He's decent," she said finally. "I think so too," Maggie said. "He came through the storm," Clara said. "When the roof was in, he didn't have to." "No," Maggie said. "He didn't." "That counts," Clara said, decisive, as if she'd weighed it against several other things and arrived at a verdict. "Yes," Maggie said. "It does." Clara picked up her bag. She was almost to the door when she turned back. "Mrs. Reed," she said, trying it out. Then she made a face. "That's going to be strange to say. You can still call me Miss Collins if you prefer," Maggie said. "No," Clara said. "I'll get used to it." She paused at the door. "He knows he's lucky, right, that you stayed?" Clara. "I'm not being sentimental," Clara said quickly. "It's a practical question. He should understand what he's getting, what you gave up to be here." Maggie looked at this 12-year-old girl who conducted her emotions like a military campaign, all strategy and controlled advance, and never an undefended position. And she thought not for the first time that Clara McGee was going to be something the world was not quite ready for. "He knows," Maggie said. Clara nodded once. She left. Maggie sat at the teacher's desk in the empty room and thought about what Clara had asked. He knows he's lucky, right? She thought about Nathan at the fence line saying, I don't want to be independent from you. Not as flattery, not as persuasion, but as a simple accounting of what he had discovered was true. The way he said things that were true without dressing them up for effect was one of the qualities about him that she had found most disarming from the beginning, because she had spent so long around people who dressed truth up until it was unrecognizable. She thought about what she had given up. Helena. The salary. The established school with 4 classrooms and a library and a staff of teachers. The professional credibility of a position that the Territorial Education Board considered significant enough to send a representative to negotiate in person. She had given all of that up, and she did not, sitting in the quiet of her schoolroom in the late November afternoon, feel the absence of any of it the way she had been afraid she might. What she felt was the slates on the shelf and the repaired bench and Clara's handwriting on the board, and the knowledge that 23 children had a teacher tomorrow morning who knew their names and their particular struggles and their specific capacities, and was not going to leave before the work was finished. She felt that. It was more than enough. Nathan came to the school on Friday evening with a small box in his coat pocket, and he stood in the doorway the way he always stood in doorways, as if he wanted to be clear. He was not assuming entry, and he said, I have something for you, if you want it. What is it? Maggie said. He crossed the room and put the box on the desk in front of her. She opened it. It was a ring. Simple. A small dark stone set in plain silver. Nothing elaborate, nothing that shouted. The kind of ring a man chose when he knew the woman he was giving it to would not want to be shouted at. She looked at it for a long moment. It was my mother's, Nathan said quietly. I've had it for 18 years, and I have never once thought about giving it to anyone else. Maggie looked up at him. I'm not telling you that to apply pressure, he said. I'm telling you because you asked me to tell you true things instead of useful things. She picked the ring up from the box. It was lighter than she expected, and warm from being inside his coat. And when she held it, she thought about his mother. A woman she would never meet, who had died young, who had apparently raised a son, who understood that love was something you showed in consistent quiet action rather than periodic grand gesture. She put it on. It fit imperfectly, just slightly large, which Nathan noticed immediately. We can have it sized, he said. We will, Maggie said. Next week. She looked at her hand. But I want to wear it as it is for a few days. Nathan looked at her hand too. All right, he said. It suits you, said a voice from the doorway. Both of them turned. Mrs. Aldridge was standing at the school door with a covered dish in her hands and the expression of a woman who had orchestrated nothing and happened to be passing by, which fooled neither of the people looking at her. I made a stew, she said, in case anyone at this school was hungry. Mrs. Aldridge, Nathan said. Don't Mrs. Aldridge me, she said, walking in and setting the dish on the nearest bench with the authority of a woman in her own kitchen. I've been feeding strays in this town for 20 years, and I'm not stopping now. Sit down, both of you. Maggie and Nathan looked at each other. They sat down. Mrs. Aldridge produced bowls from somewhere in her coat that defied practical explanation and served them both without ceremony, and then she sat on the teacher's chair, Maggie's chair at the teacher's desk, and folded her hands and looked at them with the expression of someone presiding over something. Now, she said. Have you told Finch? Not yet, Maggie said. Tell him tomorrow. He'll want to adjust the housing arrangement for the spring. You'll be moving to the ranch, which means your room becomes available, which means if we can get that second teacher from Missouri hired, she'll have somewhere to stay. She said all of this with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been thinking about it since Thursday morning. Nathan was looking at Mrs. Aldridge with an expression that was somewhere between startled and appreciating. Have you been planning this? He said. I've been anticipating it, Mrs. Aldridge said. There's a difference. I don't interfere. I just think ahead. She looked between them. Eat. The stew is better warm. They ate. The three of them sat in the schoolhouse in the November evening, the teacher, the rancher, and the woman who had opened her door at midnight 3 months ago and pulled a stranger in from the cold, and they ate stew and talked about nothing particularly significant, and outside the temperature dropped toward freezing, and inside the stove held its warmth, and Maggie sat with the ring on her finger, and thought that this unremarkable, comfortable, completely ordinary scene was the thing she had not known she was traveling toward when she climbed onto that stage in Billings with her 2 suitcases and her mother's recipe book, and the particular determination of a woman who has decided once and for all to stop making herself smaller. She had been traveling toward this, toward a room that was hers, toward a table where she was expected, toward people who knew her name and used it easily and without condition. She had been traveling toward belonging. Not the belonging that requires you to become someone else, not the belonging that is purchased with silence and compliance and the patient erasure of everything inconvenient about yourself, but the belonging that meets you exactly as you are and says, yes, this is what we were making room for. She looked at the ring on her hand, slightly too large warm from his coat. She looked at Nathan across the bench talking to Mrs. Aldridge about the spring road conditions and whether the east pasture fence would hold through winter entirely at ease in this room that was not his. With these women who were both in their different ways more than he had expected when he stopped at a road junction 3 months ago because something caught his attention in the dark. She looked at Mrs. Aldridge in the teacher's chair, completely at home in borrowed authority, managing everyone's comfort with the practiced ease of someone who had long since stopped distinguishing between her business and other people's well-being. And she thought, this is what I stayed for. Not the school only, not the work only, not Nathan only. This, the specific texture of this place, these people, this unlikely assembled life that had been waiting in Willow Creek, like a room that had been kept ready without knowing who it was kept for. This was what she had walked toward when she picked up both suitcases at the Billings depot and refused to leave one behind. She had been right to refuse. She had been right about all of it. About the bags, about the school, about Hargrove, about Alcott, about Helena, and what it offered, and what it would have cost. She had been right most of all about herself, about her own worth, about the stubborn, unglamorous daily decision to believe she deserved the life she was building even when no one around her seemed to agree. That belief had brought her here, to this bench, this ring, this stew gone slightly cool in the bowl she'd been neglecting while she thought. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through Willow Creek, the way Montana wind always moved, enormous and indifferent and utterly beautiful. Inside, the lamp was warm, and Margaret Collins, soon to be Margaret Reed, schoolteacher of Willow Creek, Montana Territory, picked up her spoon and finished her supper and let herself be without apology or qualification or the careful management of how much she was allowed to want. She let herself simply be here, fully, at last. Part 5. The Woman Who Found Home. George Alcott left Willow Creek on Friday morning without Maggie's signature. She watched the stage pull away from Parton's store from the schoolhouse window, and she felt nothing that surprised her. No second guessing, no cold wave of doubt, none of the things she had expected to feel when the decision became final and irreversible. What she felt instead was a quiet that had weight to it. The quiet of a room after a long conversation has finally reached its conclusion. She turned back to her students. Clara was watching her from the second bench. Maggie said nothing. She picked up the chalk and wrote the morning's first problem on the board, and Clara looked at the board for a moment, then looked back at Maggie, and something passed between them that didn't need words and was better without them. Clara picked up her slate. Class began. The town found out about Alcott's departure by noon and about Maggie's refusal by supper time, which was faster than even Willow Creek's usual rhythm. Maggie was at Parton's store when she became aware that the information had made its rounds. She could feel it in the way Gus Parton greeted her, a warmth that had moved past polite into something genuine, and in the way the 2 women near the fabric bolts looked at her differently than they had the first time she'd walked in there and been talked about behind her hand. Not everyone was pleased. A man named Dowd, who owned the second-largest cattle operation south of town, and had been openly doubtful of Maggie since her confrontation with Hargrove, said loudly enough to be heard by 3 people at the counter that a woman who turned down a good offer in a real city was either a fool or had reasons that weren't entirely professional. Maggie heard it. She set her purchases on the counter, counted her coins, and turned to face him. "Mr. Dowd," she said, I stayed because 23 children in this town deserve a teacher who thinks their education matters. If you'd like to have a conversation about the professional merits of that decision, I'm available. If you'd like to speculate about my personal reasons in a public store, I'd ask you to do it when I'm not standing 5 feet away." Dowd stared at her. Gus Parton made the sound again, the one that was not quite a laugh, and turned to his shelf. Dowd left without buying what he'd come for. Maggie picked up her purchases and walked out, and the cold air outside was very clean, and she breathed it in deliberately, the way she breathed when she needed her hands to stop shaking before anyone could see them. They stopped by the time she reached the school. That was good enough. Sunday came, and Nathan came with it. He arrived at the boarding house at 2 in the afternoon, with his hat in his hands and his good coat on, which Mrs. Aldridge observed from the front window with an expression of profound satisfaction, and immediately told Maggie about by calling up the stairs. Maggie came down in her second-best dress, which was better than her best for walking in, and she looked at Nathan standing in Mrs. Aldridge's front room, holding his hat and looking like a man who had made a decision and was standing in it, regardless of how it felt. And she thought, not for the first time, that there was something she found genuinely moving about a person who showed up without being sure of their welcome. "You're on time," she said. "I'm always on time," Nathan said. "I'll need to know if that's going to hold," Maggie said. "I have no patience for lateness. The children have taught me that." "The children have taught you a lot," Nathan said. "They teach me something every day," Maggie said. "That's why I stay." Mrs. Aldridge made a small sound from the hallway that might have been agreement, or might have been the floorboard. Neither of them looked to find out. They walked for an hour to the edge of the north pasture, where the land opened up and the sky became something you had to respect. And they talked in the way that people talk when they have already said the important things and are now learning the texture of each other, the small facts, the daily habits, the history that doesn't fit into the dramatic moments but constitutes most of an actual life. Nathan told her about his family. His father, who had come west before the war and built the original ranch structure with one hired man and a set of principles about land and ownership that Nathan had inherited along with the property. His mother, who had died when he was 17 and whose absence had taught him early that the things you depended on could leave without warning, and that the only answer to that was to build what you could and hold it carefully. Maggie told him about Ohio, about her mother's kitchen and the recipe book, and the way her mother had managed to make everyone who came through that house feel that they were exactly who they were supposed to be, which was a skill Maggie had studied her whole life and was still learning. "She sounds remarkable," Nathan said. "She was ordinary in every way that gets called ordinary," Maggie said. "She didn't do anything that would make a newspaper, but everyone who knew her was better for it." She paused. "I think that's a different kind of remarkable." Nathan thought about that. "Yes," he said. "I think it is." They walked back in the early evening, and Nathan left her at Mrs. Aldridge's door with his hat in his hand and his expression steady, and he said he would see her next Sunday, and she said she would be here, and that was all, and it was more than enough. Walking back upstairs. Maggie realized she was not calculating. She was not assessing risk or preparing defenses or mapping exits. She was simply walking upstairs after a Sunday afternoon, the way a person does when the afternoon was good and the evening is easy, and tomorrow is not something that needs to be survived. That was new. She sat with it for a while before she let herself sleep. November came in hard and fast, the way Montana. Novembers do, and the school became the center of something that Maggie had not entirely planned for, a kind of gathering point, a place where the business of the town and the needs of its children converged in ways that required constant navigation. 3 things happened in November that changed the shape of everything. The first was Dorothea Hargrove. She came back on the Monday after Alcott left as promised, and she sat in the back of the room with the particular dignity of a girl who is pretending she's not nervous, and Maggie treated her exactly like every other student. No special attention, no careful handling, no acknowledgement of the weeks of absence beyond a simple, "Good morning, Dorothea. You'll want to catch up on the long division. Clara can help you with the section you missed." Clara looked at Maggie. Maggie looked back. Clara moved to sit beside Dorothea without being asked a second time. By Friday, the two of them were arguing over a mathematics problem with the particular intensity of people who have found someone worth arguing with, and Maggie stood at the board listening to it and thought about Eleanor Hargrove on the school step, saying my daughter needs someone to argue with, and she understood then what the woman had actually been asking for. Not for Dorothea to be corrected, for Dorothea to be given someone to become. Hargrove himself came to the school the following week. Alone. This time no hat theatrics, and he waited until the children had left before he knocked on the open door. "Miss Collins," he said. "Mr. Hargrove," Maggie said. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He was a man who was not comfortable in spaces he didn't control, and the schoolhouse was clearly one of those spaces, and watching him manage that discomfort was something Maggie did with quiet attention. "Dorothea told me she solved a problem I couldn't," he said finally. "She did," Maggie said. "She worked it out in about 4 minutes. She showed her work clearly. It was correct." Hargrove was quiet. "She gets that from her mother," he said after a moment. "Eleanor was always the one who could—" He stopped. He cleared his throat. "I came to say, the roof repair, the remainder of the cost, I'll cover it." Maggie looked at him. "No conditions," he said before she could speak. "No committee meetings. No discussions about curriculum." He met her eyes directly for the first time. "Just the roof." "Thank you," Maggie said. "The children will benefit from it." He nodded. He left. Maggie sat at the teacher's desk for a long moment after she heard his boots off the step, and she looked at Dorothea's work still on the board. From that afternoon, a geometry problem solved cleanly. The work laid out in a handwriting that was becoming more confident by the week, and she thought that this was what the job actually was. Not the dramatic moments, not the confrontations, or the storms, or the letters from education boards. It was this. The slow, patient work of helping a person discover what they were capable of, and then getting out of the way while they did it. The second thing that happened in November was Clara. Clara came to Maggie on a Thursday morning with a composition she had written at home, unprompted outside of any assignment. It was 6 pages long, written in her careful, angular handwriting, and it was about her grandmother, a woman who had crossed the plains in a wagon at the age of 19, and had never once, as Clara told it, acted as if that was something worth making a fuss about. Maggie read it that evening. Then she read it again. The next morning she put it on the desk in front of Clara and said, "This is the best writing I have read by someone your age. I want you to know that." Clara looked at the composition. "It's just a family story." "Clara," Maggie said, "good writing is always a family story. It's always something true. That's what makes it good." She paused. "I want you to keep writing, not for class, for yourself. And when you're ready in a year or 2 years, I want to help you find a school that will take this seriously." Clara looked up at her. "There are schools for women now," Maggie said. "Real ones, where they teach literature and history and science to women who intend to do something with it." "My family can't—" "We'll find a way," Maggie said. "That's not your problem right now. Your problem right now is to keep writing." Clara looked at her composition on the desk. She pressed her lips together. She picked it up. "You really think it's good," she said. "Not fishing. Genuinely asking the way a person asks when they've believed something privately for a long time, and are afraid to have it confirmed because confirmation makes it real, and real things can be taken away." "I think it's exceptional," Maggie said. "And I don't say things I don't mean." Clara stood up. She put the composition in her bag. She went to her bench. She didn't look at Maggie again that morning, but halfway through the arithmetic lesson, Maggie glanced over and saw Clara writing something in the margin of her slate, not mathematics. Something else, small, careful words. And she looked away before Clara could catch her looking. That was the second thing. The third came from Nathan. He arrived at the school on a Wednesday evening 3 weeks into November, with a look on his face that Maggie had not seen before. Not the steady quiet she was used to from him, but something more unsettled, something that had clearly been building for a while, and had reached the point where it needed to be said. She sent the last student home, closed the door, and looked at him. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing happened," he said. "That's almost the problem." He sat down on the nearest bench, which he had never done before. Nathan always stood. Watching him sit was like watching a large tree lean. It told you the wind was significant. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for 2 weeks." "Just say it," Maggie said. He looked at her. "Marry me." The room went completely still. Maggie did not move. "Nathan, I know," he said quickly. "I know the timing is. I know we said Sunday dinners and proper courting, and I know it's been 6 weeks since that conversation. But I've been doing this wrong by being careful, and I know that. And the thing I keep coming back to every single morning when I get up and go out to that ranch alone is—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I have been alone a long time. I built that into something that felt like a virtue. And then you sat down on that bench and told me what you needed. And I realized I had been calling loneliness independence because it was easier." He looked up. "I don't want to be independent from you. That's what I know." Maggie stood very still. "Nathan," she said, "I told you what I need." "I remember every word," he said. "Tell me," she said. He met her eyes. "You teach," he said. "You make your own decisions. You don't disappear. The school comes with you. Whatever we build, the school is part of it." He paused. "And I tell you when something's wrong instead of managing it alone. We agreed on that one together." She looked at him for a long moment. "The ranch house," she said. "It's 1.5 miles from the school." "I know. In winter, that's not a short walk." "I have horses," Nathan said. "Good ones. You can learn to ride." "I already know how to ride," Maggie said. That surprised him. She watched it register. "Ohio isn't all parlors and schoolrooms," she said. "No," he said. "I'm learning that." He stood up from the bench. He was holding his hat again, turning it in his hands. "Is that a yes?" Maggie looked at the schoolhouse around her. At the slates by the window, the books on the shelf. Clara's geometry problem, still on the board. The stove that she had rebuilt herself in her first week, and that had not given her trouble since. She thought about the junction, about the cold road and the stars, about falling asleep beside everything she owned and waking up moving. She thought about a man who had come through a storm because he heard the roof was in, who had sat in a town hall meeting without speaking because his presence was the point, who had taken her hand at a fence line in the evening air and held it without making it into something larger than it was. She thought about what it meant to be seen, not desired, not pitied, not managed. Seen the full, complicated, real thing of her with all its edges and certainties and inconvenient requirements. "Yes," she said. "That's a yes." Nathan let out a breath. Just one breath, but it was the breath of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has finally been told he can set it down. He crossed the room and took her hands in both of his, not dramatically, not with flourish, just holding her hands the way you hold something you intend to keep. "I'll do right by you, Maggie," he said. "I know," she said, "or I wouldn't have said yes." He almost smiled. She felt it more than saw it. "We're going to be honest with each other," she said. "When it's hard too, not just when it's easy." "Yes," he said. "And you're going to come to the school Christmas performance," she said. "Clara has been rehearsing something, and she'll never forgive either of us if the room isn't full." Nathan did smile then. A real one, the kind she'd seen come out of him slowly over weeks, like something thawing. "I'll be in the front row." "Good," Maggie said. They were married the following April on a Saturday morning when the frost was still on the grass, but the sky was the particular shade of Montana blue that made people understand why anyone had ever come here in the first place. "Mrs. Aldridge cried." Harold Finch stood up very straight and looked as satisfied as a man can look when something he had a hand in starting has arrived at a good end. Earl Hobbs came in his good coat and stood near the back and said nothing to anyone and left immediately after, which was entirely consistent with everything Maggie knew of him, and which she found somehow deeply touching. Clara was there. She stood beside Maggie before the ceremony, with her composition in her bag. She'd brought it. Maggie didn't ask why, and she looked at Nathan standing at the front of the small church with the expression of someone conducting a final assessment. "He's good," Clara said. "I've decided." I'm glad you approve, Maggie said. I didn't say I approve, Clara said. I said he's good. Those are different things. Approving implies you needed my permission. Maggie looked at her. You've been spending too much time with me, Maggie said. Probably, Clara said. And she straightened Maggie's collar quick and matter-of-fact, the way you straighten something that matters to you when you don't want anyone to see that it matters. Then she went to sit down. Dorothea Hargrove was sitting in the third row. She had come alone, not with her mother, not with her father's authorization, just walked in and sat down with the self-possession of a girl who had decided she went where she chose. Eleanor Hargrove, sitting 2 rows behind her, caught Maggie's eye across the room and nodded once. Maggie nodded back. The years did what years do when the foundation is solid they built. The school grew. By the second year, Maggie had arranged with the education board for a second teacher, a young woman from Missouri named Ruth, who had twice Maggie's formal training and half her practical experience, and proved to be exactly as useful as that combination suggested. Brilliant in theory, willing to learn the real work from someone who knew it. They divided the students by age, and within 3 months, the results were visible to anyone who cared to look, which more people did than Maggie had expected. Clara won a composition prize from the Territorial Education Board. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and Maggie read it standing at the school door, and then sat down on the step and held it in her hands for a long time before she went inside to find Clara. Clara read the letter standing up. She finished it. She read it again. It's a real prize, she said. It's a real prize, Maggie said. Money and publication in the Territorial Review, and an invitation to attend the regional conference in the spring. Clara was quiet. Your grandmother's story, Maggie said. The one you wrote at home on your own time because you had something to say. Clara sat down very suddenly, the way people sit when their legs have made a decision before their mind approved it. I didn't think, she started. I know you didn't, Maggie said. That's often when the real work happens. Clara pressed the letter flat against her knee. Miss Collins, she said, and then caught herself because Maggie was Mrs. Reed now. Mrs. Reed, I want to go to one of those schools. I know, Maggie said. Can we figure out how? We've already started, Maggie said. They had. Quietly over the past months, Maggie had been writing letters to women's institutions in the East, to scholarship boards, to former colleagues in Ohio, who still had connections to educational networks. She had not told Clara because telling her before the pieces were in place would have been raising hope without foundation, and Maggie did not do that. Now the pieces were moving. How long? Clara said. 2 years, Maggie said. When you're 14. But we start now. Clara nodded. She was holding the letter with both hands. You knew I could do this, she said. Before I knew. Yes, Maggie said. How? Maggie thought about that. She thought about a woman she had never named to Clara, a teacher in Ohio 20 years ago, who had said, you can do anything you decide to do in a voice that made it feel like fact rather than encouragement. Because someone saw it in me once, Maggie said. And I learned what that looks like. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she put the letter in her bag, stood up, and went back to her bench. She picked up her slate. She began writing. That evening, Maggie walked home to the ranch in the November dark, and Nathan was on the porch when she came up the road, which had become its own kind of language between them. He was always on the porch when she was later than expected, not waiting with anxiety, but with presence. The way a lantern is present, not demanding anything, just making sure there was light. Clara won the prize, Maggie said when she reached the porch. Nathan stood up from the chair he'd been in. Tell me, he said. She told him. All of it, the letter, Clara. Sitting down suddenly, the look on her face when she read it a second time, the conversation about the Eastern schools and the 2 years and the work they'd already begun. Nathan listened, the way he listened to things that mattered all the way through without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of silence he had when he was feeling something he hadn't fully worked out how to name. She's going to do remarkable things, he said finally. Yes, Maggie said. She is. Because of you, Nathan said. Because of herself, Maggie said. I just didn't let her think otherwise. Nathan looked at her in the lamplight of the porch, the way he had taken to looking at her in the past year and a half, openly, without the careful management of his expression that had characterized the early weeks of knowing her. There was something in it that she had come to understand was the look of a man who had expected less from his life than he was getting and had not yet stopped being surprised by that. Come inside, he said. Supper's cold, but it's there. Cold supper, Maggie said. The romance of ranch life. You were warned, Nathan said. I was, she said. I came anyway. They went inside. The kitchen was warm. The table was set, the way Nathan said it when she was coming home late. Everything ready, waiting. Nothing made into a complaint that she'd kept it waiting. Just the food and the lamp and the 2 chairs pulled out. She sat down. He sat across from her. They ate supper in the kitchen of the ranch house that had been empty for 11 years before she walked up the road and changed what it meant to come home. And outside the wind moved across the Montana dark, the way it had always moved, indifferent and enormous and beautiful, and inside the lamp was warm, and the food was on the table, and 2 people sat across from each other in the quiet of a life they had built with their hands and their honesty and their willingness to stay. Maggie thought briefly about the junction, about the cold and the dark and the suitcase and the feeling of being invisible to a world that had decided not to see her. She thought about how far she was from that road. She thought about how completely she had arrived, the woman who had fallen asleep beside everything she owned on a cold Montana night, certain that nobody was coming. That woman had not been wrong to hold on. She had not been wrong to refuse to leave her bags behind, or to refuse to be less than she was, or to believe even at the bottom of the longest night that the morning was going to be worth reaching. She had been right. Not because the world changed its mind about her, because she never changed her mind about herself, and that stubborn, costly, undefeated belief in her own worth was the thing that made everything else possible. The journey had not begun when Nathan lifted her into that wagon. It had not begun when she stepped off the train in Montana with 2 suitcases and a letter from Harold Finch. It began the moment Maggie Collins decided in a cold Ohio parlor, with a man's careful words still in the air between them, that she would not become smaller to fit the space someone else had decided she deserved. It began there. And it had been leading here to this table, this lamp, this man sitting across from her, this life every mile of the way. She picked up her fork. She was home.